Hello, welcome back to another Classic Comics Trek Talk live stream, where I take a look at one of the episodes of the original Star Trek series and also take a look at the behind the scenes making of the episode. So today's episode, I'm taking a look at Tomorrow is Yesterday. Now, in production order, this was episode 21. This episode written by DC Fontana and directed by Michael O'Herlihy. As always, I'll be reading from Mark Cushman's book, These Are the Voyages, which details the behind the scenes making of this episode. So I'll start by reading from that. This is from an NBC press release on December 28th, 1966. A malfunction causes the USS Enterprise to be returned in time to the late 1960s and into an Earth orbit where it is sighted by a UFO as a US Air Force jet. Since their confrontation with the air jet is due strictly to an accidental warping of time and space, Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock agree that it is imperative to erase any recorded data on the sighting lest the normal course of Earth's events be altered. While the jet pilot, Captain Christopher Roger, or Christopher, I'm sorry, Captain Christopher, played by Roger Perry, is held incommunicado aboard the Enterprise, a landing party transports to Earth in an attempt to retrieve the records. Hello, Adega. Thanks for stopping by again, sir. As always, good to see you. I hope you are doing well, sir. Okay, struggling to find a way to get his own people home, Kirk now has the future of two more to worry about, that of Captain Christopher and Christopher's unborn son, who history says will grow up to make essential contributions to Earth's space program. The theme is similar to that of It's a Wonderful Life. Jimmy Stewart's character didn't realize how one person's life could impact others and even dramatically influence the world until a miracle opened his eyes. Tomorrow is Yesterday brings along a few miracles of its own. Okay. Uh, Now we'll go ahead and take a look at the episode itself. I will say, overall, this is a good episode. It's not, one of my particular favorites, but it's fine. All right, so we start in an unusual way. We start with scenes of Air Force jets taking off. Then we have this Air Force officer and crewman who detect a UFO on radar, and then they scramble jets to investigate. And then we see that the UFO is, in fact, the Enterprise. Now, Kirk tells us that the Enterprise was on its way to a star base for resupply when a black star of high gravitational force began to pull the Enterprise into it. I assume they mean a black hole. They went into reverse at full warp, and it caused them to catapult backward in time to the 1960s. Spock reports that warp power is now gone, and they are also in orbit above Earth, but their orbit is very low down in the atmosphere. So Kirk orders Sulu to gain altitude. Then Uhura reports that she's not receiving any of the usual Starfleet comm traffic that you would expect. She says she's picking up a different signal and plays it, and it's a news report talking about the first manned moon mission, which is going to take place in a couple of days. They realize that they have traveled back in time, and I love this look on Kirk's face here. Whoa! And then they detect a jet fighter approaching the Enterprise. They hear the pilot being ordered to force them down if possible. Spock notes that the jet may have nuclear warheads which could destroy them. Kirk orders Scotty to use the tractor beam to hold the jet in place, but then the jet begins to break apart and they have to beam the pilot aboard. He introduces himself as Captain John Christopher of the U.S. Air Force. Kirk explains that the ship and the crew are from the future. Now, on the bridge, of course, Christopher is quite taken aback when he meets Spock, of course, never having seen a Vulcan. Spock tells Kirk that they can't afford to send Captain Christopher back because he already knows too much about the future, and that information could be used to manipulate future events that are yet to come, changing the history that they know. And of course, this is the first episode that really deals with time travel in a significant way. Now, there was so originally, I should mention this episode originally was going to be the second of a two-part story, along with the Naked Time. The original plan, if you'll remember at the end of that episode, the Naked Time, Captain or not Captain, Lieutenant Riley had shut down the engines, right? So they had to do a cold start of the warp engines or of the dilithium reactor or something like that, which was very risky. And they did it, but it wound up sending them back in time about, I think it was like 3 days or something like that. Now, the original plan is they were actually going to get sent all the way back to the 60s. And then the next episode would have been this. But I think due to time and due to money considerations at the time, they decided not to do that. So this is the first episode that really deals with time travel as a significant plot element in a big way. And the first time they're facing this whole sort of, our actions could have repercussions on future events type of situation. Okay, so they meet in Kirk's quarters. Oh yeah, and so the computer addresses Kirk in a very flirtatious way. And Spock reveals that they recently had the computer overhauled at a planet with a female dominated culture. And they decided to give the computer a personality that seems to be very amorous towards Kirk. It refers to him as dear and that sort of thing. And that's I think this was Gene Coon's idea. When we get to the behind the scenes stuff, we'll learn more about that. But Gene Coon was very keen, I think, to bring more humor into the show. And look, I like humor and all, but I do think that this whole thing with the computer in the episode is kind of, I don't know, it just feels kind of shoehorned in. It's just there for no particular reason except to elicit a few laughs, and it just feels kind of contrived to me. Okay, so Kirk then reveals that they won't send Captain Christopher back as his returning could change future events. Now, Christopher argues that his absence could cause changes as well, but Spock dismisses that, saying that the historical records show no historical notable contributions by Captain Christopher. So if they take him back to the future with them, his absence will have a negligible effect on history. Now, Christopher says that he has a family and he demands to be returned, but Kirk refuses. Uh, Scotty then informs him that the engine repairs are coming along, but notes that even if they can get the warp engines fixed, in this time period, they really don't have anywhere to go. And Captain Christopher notes that while he can't go back, Kirk and the Enterprise crew can't go back where they belong either. Now, later, Christopher attempts to escape. And again, there is no security watching their prisoner. It's is okay. It just drives me nuts. Kirk confronts him. Okay, so he gets to to the transporter room, but then Kirk arrives and he knocks Christopher out. Later, Christopher wakes up in sick bay. Spock arrives and he informs Kirk that Christopher will, in fact, have a son who is going to command the first manned mission to Saturn, meaning that they will have to return Captain Christopher to Earth after all. Okay, now later in the conference room, Kirk and Spock agree that they have to destroy all evidence of their presence in this time period, including the photos that were taken by the camera in Christopher's jet and radio transmissions as well. They plan to infiltrate the base where the records are kept and destroy them. Christopher offers to go along, but Kirk refuses, saying that the risk to Christopher is too great because, again, if he got injured, it could really screw up future events. So Kirk and Sulu beam down during the night to remove the records, and of course, they immediately get caught. Um, now, this is interesting. Oh, hey, J Man. Thanks for stopping by, man. I like this one, but didn't love it. Yeah, that's kind of my feeling on it, too. Pretty much what I said at the beginning. So it's interesting because when they break into this room where the computer records are, uh, okay, actually, I think I've got the slides a little out of order. It should be this slide. You can't see it well, but Kirk has this device and he basically uses it like a sonic screwdriver, where he uses it to undo the lock on the door and then he uses it again to open up the computer cabinets. Now, I doubt that the people who watched the show actually saw Doctor Who personally, but you wonder if they maybe didn't get that idea from Doctor Who. Okay, yeah. So as I said, they immediately get caught, and this kind of cracked me up because when the guard confronts them, he distinctly says, specifically says, remove those weapon belts you have and hand them over to me one at a time. He specifically says one at a time, and then he immediately hands them both over at once. So it's like you can't even follow simple instructions, can you? Okay. Um, okay, so Kirk and Sulu beam down and they remove the records. The guard takes their weapons and communicators. Now, on the Enterprise, Spock and McCoy are growing concerned and they signal the landing party. Now, the guard then accidentally activates the distress signal on one of the communicators and the Enterprise beams him up. And of course, he's shocked to see Spock. So now we have another guy from the past who has seen too much. Kirk and Sulu then go to the photo lab to retrieve the photos, but they trigger a security alarm, and the security staff come running, and Kirk and Sulu find the photos, the film for the photos, but then the security arrives, and Kirk gets into a fight with these security personnel. And then while they're fighting, Sulu beams back up. Kirk is captured and subsequently is interrogated. Now, Spock plans a rescue mission with he, Sulu, and Captain Christopher beaming down. They subdue the guards, but before they can beam back up, Christopher takes a gun from one of the downed guards and refuses to let them beam back up to the Enterprise. Now, luckily, Spock subdues him with a neck pinch, and they all beam up. Later, they attempt a slingshot maneuver to return to their own time. I love that look on his face. They planned a slingshot maneuver to return to their own time. And then, once they slingshot around the sun, they'll start going back in time. And then when they get back in time far enough where they can beam the guard and Captain Christopher back without screwing up time, they'll beam them off basically back to the point in time where they had been when they first encountered the Enterprise. So they then perform the slingshot maneuver. And I like this shot here where you see the solar flare in the background. It just looks really nice. I love that image. Okay. So then they beam Captain Christopher back. And honestly, this The science of this doesn't really make a lot of sense because they're basically beaming this person back into the body of his past self. It's like, can that work? Can you beam a body into another body? It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, honestly. It's a bit of plot contrivance so they can just kind of wrap things up conveniently. And then they do the same thing with the guard. And they return to the future. And then here's Starfleet transmissions, and they realize they are in the right place and the right time. And it ends there. Again, directed by Michael O'Herlihy and written by DC Fontana. This was Fontana's second episode, her first episode being Charlie X. Roger Perry played Major Christopher. Hal Lynch, I guess, is I guess he's the guy that got beamed up. And Colonel Fellini, he's the guy that was interrogating Kirk. Now, John Winston, who plays the transporter chief, he plays Mr. Kyle, and he makes several appearances on Star Trek, so he'll be in several more episodes. Okay, so we'll go ahead and take a look at the book now. Let me go back here. All right. So, as with many episodes of Star Trek, Tomorrow is Yesterday is at its core a celebration of life. Captain Christopher is a jet age cog in a wheel, but as we discover, even a cog can keep the wheels of progress moving in a unique and positive way. The cleverness of DC Fontana's story is richly layered. The concept of having a 1960s contemporary man receive a guided tour of the Enterprise, and for us to see the wonderment that is Star Trek through his eyes, struck a chord with the fans. The comedy, including the sexy computer voice flirting with Kirk, was inspired. And I don't know about that. It is the humor and the interaction between guest players and regulars which elevate this episode to classic status. The passage of time, however, has left its mark on Tomorrow is Yesterday, making it a flawed classic. There are a handful of questionable plot points, mostly with regard to science. Yeah, no kidding. The idea of our crew being able to beam two 20th century men home with split second precision while the Enterprise is hurtling through space and time and shaking apart at the seams is hard to fathom. Not helping are the photographic effects. We are supposed to believe the Enterprise is accelerating into a slingshot effect around the sun, but in the original episode, what we see is the ship simply vibrating in place. James Doohan, 30 years later, would say the special effects shaking the ship slightly, that sort of thing seems primitive compared to what you see nowadays. But back then, we were cutting edge, and the viewership was willing to take a good deal on faith, as opposed to today's far more literal minded fans who scrutinize every effect and hold it up to the highest standard. Dorothy Fontana said, the effects weren't the best. I mean, they were as good as we could get them at the time on the budget we had. We had to have it pretty fast. We also had to have it reasonably cheap. So some of that suffered, no question. But I'm proud of the fact that the story pretty well holds up. The acting pretty well holds up, as does the directing. The intent of the stories comes across, and I think the relationships, especially Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, were always there. It was in the scripts, it was on the stage, and all the other stuff, well, we just had to hope that it played, that it would all work out. Unlike a good wine, the technical aspects of Tomorrow is Yesterday have not necessarily aged well, but even a bottle of cheap port can contribute to a good time if one can appreciate the year it was corked. By 1966 standards, this is a delightful installment of Star Trek. Taken as that, it remains delightful. Okay, so Dorothy Fontana contributed her second script to the series, and it would be the second episode in a row to be produced from material that sped through the normally slow and painfully laborious process of going from an outline to a revised outline to various revised teleplays. This one came together with nearly the same ease and speed as Arena and match that episode's success. The reason? Gene Kuhn wrote one, Dorothy Fontana wrote the other. The lesson wasn't lost on executive producer, producer, and associate producer, nor was it lost on the writer. It was during this period that Fontana made the decision to go from a full-time secretary and part-time writer to writing full-time. Fontana recalls, I had done the teleplay for Charlie X, and I was in the middle of writing Tomorrow Was Yesterday, and I came to the conclusion that I just didn't want to be a secretary anymore. And I said to myself, I think I'll give it a try. I've got some money in the bank, and even if I don't sell anything, I'll be okay. At least I'll have tried. Actually, I was kind of hoping that Gene might let me write some more Star Trek. So I gave my 3 weeks notice and said, Gene, I love working for you, but I really want to write. I've been working for this all my life. I have to give it my best shot. And Gene could appreciate the ambition because at one point he had to face a similar choice in regard to leaving the police force. So he survived, and he did hate losing a good secretary. The initial premise for this episode, a mere germ of an idea, was intended to be part two of The Naked Time. Tomorrow Was Yesterday actually springboarded off of John D.F. Black, Fontana said. There was a plan to do a part two, but that never happened. John left the series, and as a result, The Naked Time was just sort of there. It was a contained episode. It didn't need any more. But there was the idea of going back in time, and I suggested doing it. Fontana was immediately struck by the dramatic and comedic potential of the story that would transport the Enterprise to modern day Earth and have it regarded as a UFO. Robert Justman also had been struck by the dramatic and comedic potential of this type of story 6 months earlier. On April 12th of 1966, even predating the first draft of The Naked Time, Justman sent a memo to Roddenberry suggesting a story idea for the series. He wrote, the Enterprise is returning to Earth. There is a malfunction of the ship's machinery with regard to time warp capability. The Enterprise does arrive back at Earth, but this is Earth of 1966 and not of their time. The Enterprise is sighted and is identified as a UFO. Kirk begins to see by breaking through time. He is starting off a whole sequence of events which will affect the history and civilization of our planet in future years. Perhaps it will turn out that he and Spock and the Enterprise and its crew will therefore never really exist in the future. Thereupon, the problem arrives as to how they are going to go back and change what they have already set in motion. With the arrival of DC Fontana's treatment for Tomorrow Is Yesterday, and then 1 month later a full screenplay, Justman was convinced that he had sparked the story by his memo. On December 1st, he wrote another memo to Roddenberry, this time asking to be compensated for the story. He would not be. Gene gave Bob neither credit nor payment for the story, Herb Solow said. In fact, he never even thanked him. Quote, at the time I was disappointed, Justman said. I knew that he had come up with a number of story ideas for the show, springboards as he called them. And he claimed that he wouldn't get paid for them, that they were part of his duties as the creator of the show. Since I was part of the management team, I rationalized that if Gene could do this sort of thing gratis, then so could I. At that time, I had no idea that Gene was receiving extra money from the studio for this extra work. Ah, surprise, surprise, Gene lied. What do you know? Who would have guessed? Then again, perhaps this was not a case of denying credit where it was rightfully due, a common occurrence in television production. Perhaps it was a case of a different sort of common occurrence in TV, two creative people thinking along the same lines. Quote, Bob Justman swears he wrote a memo suggesting the story, said DC Fontana. I never saw the memo. I came up with it on my own. Well, maybe, I guess. I don't know. We'll just have to take her word for it, I suppose. Now, with this story, Gene Coon's presence is clear. Hold on a second. Let me take a drink of water right quick. Okay. With this story, Gene Coon's presence is clear, supporting Fontana's inclination to add humor to a series that just a short while before had played completely straight. With Fontana writing and Kuhn polishing, it was now comedy relief roasted to perfection. This was Star Trek's first semi comical episode. One clever addition was the idea of the flirtatious computer, which had gotten a personality overhaul during a visit to a planet governed by women. Kuhn had liked the idea of the computer becoming emotional in the early drafts of the court martial episode. But with Fontana, saw it presented in a much more lively fashion here. So, if you'll recall, and if you haven't seen my Trek Talk on court martial, in early drafts of the court martial, the computer, I forget exactly how it was set up, but basically the crewman that was believed to have died, the computer is portrayed as having a personality, basically, and the computer liked the crewman that had supposedly been killed by Kirk. So the computer turns against Kirk and is the main witness against him. In the episode as it's aired, it's just the computer records, but in the original version of the episode, the computer itself is saying Kirk is guilty, and that later got written out. Also, new information was added to the series Bible as a result of this script. Kirk mentions that there are 12 starships in the fleet, and the other 11 are identical in design and size to the Enterprise. So, this is one of the first episodes that gives a reference to other ships, specifically other Constitution class ships in Starfleet. Okay, so director Michael O'Herlihy was new to the series. Hello, Jay Rocker. Good to see you, sir. Thank you for stopping by. He was 47 and had cut his teeth as a director for Warner Brothers with their factory produced series such as Maverick, Bronco, and 77 Sunset Strip. Roddenberry knew O'Herlihy from The Lieutenant, where he called the shots on one episode. Roger Perry, who played Captain John Christopher, was a prominent guest star on TV. He had already been the co star of two series. When I go in, there he is. He had been the star on the 1960s series Harrington and Son, and also on 1963's Arrest and Trial. Or I'm sorry, no, he was a co-star on those shows. And then he was also the lead in the 1966 film T.H.E. Cat. Regarding Star Trek, Perry said, quote, "It had never happened to me this way before or since, but I went into Desilu and there was nobody in the office except the secretary, and she said, 'You can go right in.' So I walked in and there was Michael O'Herlihy sitting alone in the room behind the desk. We talked for maybe 5 minutes and he said, 'Okay, you'll do. We'll see you on the set.' And that was it. Star Trek was the easiest interview I ever had." As for the script he was given, Perry added, "I thought it was a good part, and the twist was interesting about how when you go back in time, you can alter history. That whole concept was a little strange to me at the time because I wasn't a sci fi fan, so I'd never heard that sort of story before about a time warp and trying not to change what would be the future. So I found that kind of interesting. And the whole concept about the son being born, I remember thinking right away that was a good scene. My son at the time was about 7 or 8 years old, so that whole subject struck a chord with me." Ed Peck, who played the humorless Colonel Fellini, starred in his own short lived series in 1951, playing the title character of Major Del Conway of the Flying Tigers. I've never heard of that show. John Winston made his first of 11 appearances as Transporter Chief Kyle. And, they say this is in the book. I'll have to go and check because they say here that this is his first of 11 appearances. Um, Yeah, I mean, I guess it was. I was thinking maybe he was in a previous episode, but I guess maybe I'm remembering wrong. Quote, "It never occurred to me when Joe Agosta called that it would be more than one job. I'd never heard of Star Trek at that point. I was of the stage, that's where I worked, so that's where I got my best roles. For this, I simply went in as an actor, made sure I was there on time, got into makeup, and then and then waited until the director wanted me. I just said, 'What do you want me to do with the lines?' Then one, two, three. When you're a bit actor here in Hollywood, and invariably the director doesn't want more from you than just to say the lines. Don't blow it so they don't have to do another take. Do it right the first time and let them get on with it. Winston didn't blow it. He brought more to the role than he gives himself credit for. Others recognized his contribution and he would return. Majel Barrett got to add personality to the ship's computer. Hearing the machine flirt with Kirk is a delight. Um, yeah, I don't know. What it reminds me of, I would compare it to Star Trek 4 and Star Trek 5, right? So in Star Trek 4, obviously there's a lot of humor, but the humor it just comes from the story because Star Trek is a fish out of water story. They're back in this other time period. And they don't understand how things work, double dumbass on you and what is exact change and all that stuff. But if you watch the movie, the beginning of the movie and the end, which are both in the future in their own time, plays it pretty straightforward. But then in Star Trek 5, because humor played well with the audience, they decided to play up humor in Star Trek 5. And again, you had them just kind of shoehorning a lot of humor in that really was just there, obviously, just to draw a cheap laugh. Like, probably the worst example is Scotty like bonking his head and knocking himself out, that sort of thing. And that's how I would compare the the computer voice here. It just feels very kind of shoehorned into me. And I just don't feel it needed to be there. Unlike with, say, The Trouble with Tribbles, where a lot of the humor really does come from the story. Okay. Um, so principal photography began on a Monday on stage 9 for the majority of the sequences on the ship's bridge, portions of which were in dire need of repair. Yeah, so, and this was something I actually noticed in the last episode in the alternative factor. And let me see if I can find a good picture of it here. But those view screens on the wall there, if you can, yeah, if you can kind of see the view screens there above Spock's head, they're warped. They're clearly not completely flat anymore. And I did notice that last episode, but they look even worse here. And apparently, the moving of the stages and just wear and tear on the stage had caused them to get kind of warped out of shape. And there would be a refurbishing of the main set. Yeah, the small screens above Spock and Uhura's stations and elsewhere appeared battered. They looked more like abused props than the advanced technology they were supposed to be. 6 months of separating and moving sections of the bridge around for various camera angles was taking its toll. When the footage was screened for the producers, a mandate was immediately issued to replace the screens. We would see an improvement in the following episode. Of his first day on the bridge, Roger Perry said, quote, "I thought the sets were terrific. I wasn't quite used to that in television, certainly not on the Harrington set and Arrest and Trial. I'd never seen anything like it." And Perry was among familiar faces. He said, quote, "I knew who Shatner was. The first time I'd seen him was in The Brothers Karamazov, and I had seen Leonard in an independent movie that year, kind of a deep, dark subject, one of those intense movies, which was called Death Watch. And I told him when I saw him on set that I thought he was terrific in that." And if I remember right, is that the movie? Uh, no, I think that's a different thing. Okay, never mind. I was thinking of something else. Regarding his last day with the company, Roger Perry said, quote, "I was talking to Bones, DeForest Kelly, about my shirt, which he was wearing. Of course, later in the episode, he's given a Starfleet uniform to wear. I can find him in it. Here we go. And he said, "I kind of like this. I wonder if I could take it home." And Kelly said, "Well, they frown upon that, but you should probably just stick it into your bag and nobody's going to say anything." Perry said, "Well, I didn't do it, but looking back now with all that Star Trek has become, I wish I had." Yeah, he probably, if he had kept that, he could have sold that for a nice little return. Michael O'Hurley finished on schedule and on budget. Everyone, cast, crew, network, and the fans were thrilled with the results. O'Herlihy later admitted how he had been immediately drawn to the material and to the characters. Oblivious to the contributions from Fontana, Justman, and Kuhn, he had attributed the success of the series and the episode he directed entirely to Gene Roddenberry. Well, he wouldn't be the only one, would he? The one thing I did like is that Gene Roddenberry went into the realm of science fiction, but he didn't go too far too often. You have a story to tell, and you must tell it with as much honesty as you can, that this did in fact happen. You can't say this only happened because we're making science fiction. You must consider that this is the way people live. I don't think that human nature has ever changed or it ever will. One of the reasons that Star Trek became so successful was that Gene Roddenberry instinctively kept the people human. It's always a question of search and conflict that makes good drama. O'Herlihy was asked to direct again, but he would turn down the offer in order to do a Disney Western called Smith. Although here in the book it's got a exclamation point at the end, so it's more like Smith. He later said, Star Trek in those days was just another bloody show. It was a 6-day show with fellows in funny pajamas. I thought Smith would be a better career move. Unfortunately, Smith bombed. Okay, Tomorrow is Yesterday first aired on Thursday, January 26, 1967. The following day, during a test flight of Apollo 1, or not a test flight, but during testing of Apollo 1, a fire broke out in the Apollo 1 capsule and it would kill astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. And if I remember, the fire, I don't remember what exactly caused the fire. I guess it was a short circuit or something, but the fire started and spread so quickly. They later determined the reason the fire got out of control so quick was that at that time they were using pure oxygen as air inside the capsules in the ships. And after this incident, they would change and alter the air supply in the Apollo capsules to being more like Earth's atmosphere, where it was actually mostly nitrogen. You know, our atmosphere is only, I think, about what 16% oxygen, I believe it is. It's mostly nitrogen. Watching the episode, Roger Perry said, I thought it was done well, shot well. It was a good episode. When I watched it, being self critical, I felt could have done just a little bit more, reacted to a bit more of what I was seeing. I thought, should I have done more when I beamed up? Okay, so for the first half hour, Tomorrow Was Yesterday was second in its time slot, behind Bewitched. I swear, Bewitched was always beating it. And it came in just barely ahead of My Three Sons to snag the second spot with a 27.7% share. And then the second half hour won its time slot with a 32.2% share. The slingshot around the sun technique, having worked here, would be used again by the crew of the Enterprise in Star Trek for The Voyage Home. DC Fontana said, quote, this was a fun show to write, and it was an easy one to write. It was one of my favorite episodes. What I liked about it best was that that everything Kirk does, which is by the book, exactly the right thing to do, is the wrong thing up until the middle of the episode, and then he starts pulling it together and makes it right. But I had a chance to have a little fun with it, particularly with Kirk, because Shatner could play comedy. Director Mike O'Herlihy said, I rather liked the script. I'm not a science fiction fan, but even I could relate to it and understand it. I enjoyed it very much. DeForest Kelly said, I had hardly anything to do in Tomorrow Was Yesterday. I was very light in it, but I thought it was one of the best. And Roger Perry said, the show is a classic and for good reason. Oh, yeah. And so for a grade on this one, I'll give it, what, a B. Uh, B minus, maybe. I'll give it a B minus because again, the time travel stuff at the end kind of doesn't really add up. So I'll dig in a little bit for that. But it's a solid, fun episode. No, nothing wrong with it really. Nothing seriously wrong. Okay, where am I at? 42 minutes. So this is a quick one. So I'll go ahead and wrap this one up here. I will be back next week with what's the next episode? The next episode is Return of the Archons. So I'll be back next week for that one. And I guess until then, everyone take care. Thanks to everyone who stopped by to check out the stream. And please do like the stream before you go, if you would. And also please sub to the channel if you haven't. And check out some of my other videos while you're here. And I will see you all next time. Have a good night.